So here we are at chapter 18 of Reasons and Persons, and chapter 17 was the repugnant conclusion. And the repugnant conclusion was about how if we value, if we don't focus on harming individuals. So, all right, backtrack a little bit further. The chapter before that was the non-identity problem. The non-identity problem says that if our idea of something being worse for people is what constrains whether or not we do something, then it looks like decisions we make that affect who exists, whether they're reproductive decisions or they're just decisions that have an effect hundreds of years in the future, then it looks like apparently bad decisions cannot be explained as bad in terms of being worse for people. So, for example, the risky policy he describes in the chapter on the non-identity problem. The risky policy is when we use nuclear power and we bury the waste and it's safe for 300 years, but we know that it's likely to leak after that, and in fact it does, and it causes widespread cancer and death. It sounds like we shouldn't do the risky policy because it will have this effect of killing people in the future. But because our decision to employ the risky policy will give us short-term benefits, that will affect who exists in the future, because people will make reproductive decisions and so on, and it will affect who exists. So because of all these factors, if we employ the risky policy, one set of people will exist in the future. If we don't employ the risky policy, another set of people will exist in the future. So the people that end up dying of cancer, if we didn't employ the risky policy, wouldn't even exist. So they can't really say it's bad for them that we employ the risky policy, even though the risky policy ends up causing them cancer, because if we didn't employ the risky policy, they wouldn't exist at all. So the non-identity problem is explaining why the risky policy is bad, because we can't explain why it's bad in terms of it being bad for the people that it affects, because the policy itself also causes them to exist. So in an attempt to solve that, in an attempt to come up with a theory that says that the risky policy is bad, we focused instead, we had an impersonal principle. And the impersonal principle says we're not going to say that something is bad because it makes people's lives worse. We're just going to say it's bad because it causes bad stuff. But that seemed to solve the non-identity problem, but it itself had the problem of leading to the repugnant conclusion. Because if we just focus on quantity of happiness or well-being or welfare in the future, then it turned out that our theory implied that we should have as many people, as many children as possible to produce a vastly overpopulated world, just so long as everybody there lived a life that was just barely worth living. Because if they lived a life that was just barely worth living, if there were enough of them, it added up to more total welfare than the sum of 10 million people, which is, his magic number is 10 million people is what he thinks the near future will bring. And as I said, we're at 8 million right now. I think when he was writing this in the 80s, billion. I think when he was writing this in the 80s, the world population was about just over 3 billion, which gives you some idea of how fast we've progressed since then. But anyway, so he imagined a possible future where everybody had a really great standard of living and there were 10 billion of them. And that seems to be that was A in his chart in the repugnant conclusion. And the bad problem for the theory that appeared to solve the non-identity problem is that it had the implication that, you know, billions and billions and billions of people just barely living, you know, having a life that was just barely worth living, was a better result than having this apparently much better future where there was only 10 billion of us, but we all had a high standard of living. So we want to avoid that. So the first problem was the non-identity problem. In coming up with a theory of beneficence, that is a theory of how we should care for others, the first problem was the non-identity problem. Then in trying to solve that, we led to the repugnant conclusion. So theory X is his name, his placeholder name for the perfect theory of beneficence that will get it right, that will get the right conclusions, imply the right results in all of these scenarios. It will pick the future. It will rank highest the future that we think is the best. And so far in these chapters, he hasn't come up with it. In chapter 18, the absurd conclusion, he adds to this list, we've got to solve this, we've got to solve this, and we've also got to explain the asymmetry. What is the asymmetry? Well, in the previous chapter, he mentioned the happy child, who is a couple has a child whose life will be great. And now in this chapter, in section 132, he mentions the wretched child. The wretched child is someone whose life will be miserable. Let's say they know that it has the genetic marker for some horrible fatal disease like Hallappo-Siemens syndrome. Of the wretched child, he says, it is clear that it would be wrong knowingly to conceive such a child. The wrongness would mostly come from the predictable, appalling quality of this child's life. So the asymmetry, which should sound familiar from our discussion of David Benatar's work, the asymmetry is that it is wrong to bring the wretched child into existence, but that it doesn't seem that we have a moral duty to bring the happy child into existence. It seemed like when we were being led to the repugnant conclusion, it looked like we did have a moral duty to bring the happy child into existence, because that would increase our goal at that point with the theory that we were working with seemed to be to maximize the total amount of happiness, and one way to do this was to bring happy people into existence. But to avoid the repugnant conclusion, we want to stick to the idea that there is no moral duty to bring the happy child into existence, even though there is a moral duty to avoid the repugnant conclusion. Now, another problem with the theory we were working with in the previous chapter, the repugnant conclusion, was a common criticism of utilitarianism. So utilitarianism is a very simple moral theory that you should be familiar with. There are many variants of it, of course, but the essential idea is that it's a consequentialist theory. That means that what makes a policy or action right or wrong is the consequences it brings about. And the consequences that are valued by utilitarianism are ones that raise the level of, the total level of happiness or well-being or whatever, usually happiness. If we're talking about the original kind of simple, straightforward utilitarianism invented by a guy called Jeremy Bentham, it's pleasure. It's just pleasure. He was a pure hedonist. So the idea there is, if you're working out the right policy or action will be the one that maximizes the sum total of pleasure over pain. So you add up all the pleasures that you cause, you subtract all the pains, you've got a measuring stick. You can quantify pleasure according to, in Bentham's terms, units called hedons. And when you come up with the highest total of hedons, that's the option that you should pick. Well, that seemed to be basically the idea we were working with, that led to the repugnant conclusion, because it said, let's look at the sum total of happiness, which is the area of the bar, and if you had an incredibly wide bar, which means that you had billions and billions of people, that made up for the fact that it had a very low height, which was the quality of life. The total area was still greater than the total area of the future that we thought was better, with only 10 billion people, but a really high standard of living. The total, if you're focusing on the total area, you end up with a repugnant conclusion. One of the criticisms of utilitarianism is it seems to be too impersonal. That is, it focuses on the pleasure and sort of says that the pleasure is the important thing, and people are only valuable insofar as they are containers of pleasure. So it seems dehumanizing in this effect. And Parfit illustrates this criticism by quoting this guy Mackay. Incidentally, there's an obvious mistake in here, because he refers to the book, this is on page 393, he refers to a book called The Technology of Happiness, but if you look in the index, it's The Economy of Happiness. Now, I happen to know the index was done by Jeff McMahon's then wife, and she was probably a lot more reliable than Parfit himself. And Reasons and Persons, according to Jeff McMahon, who was there at the sort of finishing up of Reasons and Persons, it was down to the wire. The publisher had demanded this book by a deadline, and he was working away right up to the last minute, and it was pre-computers, so there were just papers everywhere. So there's bound to be some mistakes in Reasons and Persons, and this is one of them. So he says, in his book, The Technology, which is really the economy of happiness, this guy Mackay writes, just as a boiler is required to utilize the potential energy of coal in the production of steam, so sentient beings are required to convert the potentiality of happiness resident in a given land area into actual happiness. And just as the engineer will choose boilers with the maximum efficiency at converting steam into energy, justice will choose sentient beings who have the maximum efficiency at converting resources into happiness. You can see the dehumanizing language pretty clearly there, that, that humans are viewed as if they were steam boilers. So he refers to this as the steam production model, although later in the chapter he refers to the milk production model. So again, I think that's another mistake, and that they're one and the same thing. So the steam production model is this dehumanizing view, where all we care about is the happiness. We don't care about the humans for whom it is happiness. So we want to avoid that, because that's part of the problem that's led to the repugnant conclusion. So we want person-affecting principles. Now, this is a tricky balance that we've got to achieve, because it looked like we moved to an impersonal model because we were trying to avoid the non-identity problem, because the non-identity problem came about from us saying the only way we can say a policy is bad is if it's bad for particular people. And, there was a problem in specifying, when you're bringing people into existence, there's a problem in specifying that it's bad for them. So how is Parfit going to avoid the steam production model by making his principles person-affecting without going back and recreating the non-identity problem? Well, it turns out if you use a narrow person-affecting principle, you do, again, create the non-identity problem. Now, the narrow person-affecting principle, well, first of all, he says, our person-affecting principles have to meet 3 rules. This is on page 394. He says, if someone is caused to exist and has a life worth living, this person is thereby benefited. All right, why is he saying this? So this claim that we benefit people by bringing them into existence, that's in a sense a controversial claim. Of course, David Benatar would disagree with this. That's his whole thing. But why is Parfit suddenly committing to this? Because actually, if you notice, he has been careful not to commit to this idea. In the previous chapters, he said, if we say that bringing people into existence benefits them, then this would be true. If we don't say that, then this would be true. He's always given both options and remained agnostic as to whether or not bringing people into existence benefits them. And of course, the reason why he was agnostic is because this appears to involve a weird comparison between what's good for someone when they exist and what's good for someone when they don't exist. And of course, there's nothing that's good for someone when they don't exist, because they don't exist. So that's why people don't like making the comparison. It leads to weird results like we saw in Benatar. On a suggestion by Jeff McMahon that actually we've come across when we read his 80s article on death, Parfit in an Appendix G in Reasons and Persons suggests that, yes, there's a good argument that can be made that bringing people into existence benefits them, and it doesn't require us saying that existing is better than non-existing. It just means that existing is good. So existing is good, and in the sense that in causing someone to exist, we've given them something good, we can say we've benefited them. So this is what you can say to your kids. You know, I benefited you, you little bastard, because your life is worth living, so long as you don't piss me off any further. So therefore, your life is good. Now, if they retort, but it's not better than non-existence, I don't know what kind of kids you have that would retort that, but suppose they did, you would have to concede that. It's not better than non-existence, but it is good. So now, why is Parfit suddenly insisting on this point, that if someone is caused to exist and has a life worth living, of course, they don't have Halapo-Seaman syndrome or something, then this person is thereby benefited? Because then we can say that people in the future that exist as a result of our policy, we can count them as people that are benefited from the policy, and we can say that this is a person-affecting way of calculating whether the policy is good or bad, because their very existence is a benefit that they got. Those persons are the ones that are affected by the policy. Now, of course, if we use the narrow person-affecting principle, that says that well, let me finish reading the three principles on page 394. So the first one is if someone is caused to exist and has a life worth living, this person is thereby benefited. If other things are equal, it is wrong knowingly to make some choice that would make the outcome worse, which is sort of the total that we're looking at. If other things are equal, one of two outcomes would be worse if it was worse for people. All right, that phrase, worse for people. How we interpret that phrase, worse for people, will affect whether or not we have what he calls the narrow person-affecting principle or the wide person-affecting principle. Now, what led to the non-identity problem was interpreting worse for people in the narrow sense, which, as he says on page 395, worse for people in the narrow sense, if the occurrence of X rather than Y, risky policy rather than, say, safe policy, would be either worse for or bad for the X people. Now, the X people are the people that exist because of policy X. And of course, if we just focus on them, then we have to say the risky policy isn't bad for the X people, because the X people owe their existence to policy X, which in this case is the risky policy. So that's why that has the non-identity problem. But there's another way to interpret worse for people in the principle, if other things are equal, one of two outcomes would be worse if it were worse for people. And that is to interpret it in the wide way. And there's actually two kinds of wide ways. There's the wide total. This stands for wide total person affecting principle. There's the wide total or the wide average. So, worse for people in the wide total sense, if the total net benefit given to the X people by the occurrence of X, this is if we institute the risky policy, would be less than the total net benefit given to the Y people by the occurrence of Y. So here, the reason why it's a wide, but also a person affecting principle, is we're saying that we're not just looking at the sum total of happiness and ignoring who it belongs to. We're looking at the happiness as valuable because it's happiness for particular people. But we're allowed to compare one set of people to another set of people and say we're going to we're caring about this happiness because it's happiness for people. But we're looking at both the effects of X on the X people and effects of Y on the Y people. So suppose we're choosing between risky policy and safe policy. What we do is we say, what is the effects of risky policy on the people that will exist because of it? Okay, they're pretty miserable because they're dying of cancer. What are the effects of safe policy on the people that exist because of safe policy? Oh, they're pretty happy. So we can compare in the wide, we can compare the effects on the X people to the effects on the Y people, and the better effects are the better ones. So now obviously the X people would say, hey, wait a minute, but if you choose Y, we won't exist. Well, too bad for you, because we want to avoid the non-identity problem. All right, so this is what he's doing in this whole thing. He's trying to solve the non-identity problem, which, when we tried to solve it before, meant going impersonal. But going impersonal led to the repugnant conclusion, and also going impersonal leads to the criticism that is leveled against utilitarianism, that it's inhuman. It just cares about humans as humans are no longer intrinsically valuable, they're just instrumentally valuable as vessels for happiness. That's the steam production model problem. So we want to go back to a person affecting principle to avoid the steam production model and the repugnant conclusion, but we want to get a person affecting principle that won't lead to the non-identity problem. The narrow one will, but the wide one won't. Now you can still imagine the same critics who said that utilitarianism was impersonal saying, wait a minute, this isn't really person affecting because you're comparing quantities of happiness. What are you comparing between the X and Y people? You're comparing the amount of happiness that the X people have to the amount of happiness that the Y people have. This is just a kind of sneaky way of going back to what you were doing before. And he gets into a little bit of a discussion with that and saying, well, all right, if you don't like the way I've phrased it this way, there's another way of phrasing it. But I don't want to get into that. So now we want to know, well, which is better? Is the wide total person affecting principle better, or the wide average? Well, the problem with the wide total is it goes right back to the repugnant conclusion. If we say that only the quantity, which is the area of the graphs, has value, then because Z has a much larger area, then it will be the better option, which was the repugnant problem. So wide total person affecting principle won't work. So what we've got to do is somehow limit the way that quantity trumps quality, because that's the repugnant conclusion, is the vast quantity of the area of bar Z is bigger than the limited area of bar A with the much higher quality of life. So we've got to obviously our solution is going to be somewhere in this column that says answers no to the question on page 403 with the weird chart. Could a loss in quality be outweighed by a gain in quantity? So our theory X will probably be somewhere in this column. So what about the wide average person affecting principle? So that says, that interprets worse for in the sense that something will be worse for people in the wide average sense if the average net benefit per person given to the X people by the occurrence of X, risky policy, would be less than the average net benefit per person given to the Y people by the occurrence of Y, safe policy or whatever. That's the wide average person affecting principle. Now, the problem with this one is that it doesn't take quantity into account at all. It just looks at average. And to illustrate the problem with this, he talks about the two hells. In hell 1, just 10 innocent people suffer great agony for 50 years. In hell 2, you have 10 million innocent people who suffer equal agony for 50 years minus 1 day. Now, what does this say is the least bad option? Well, clearly this one says hell 2, because each of the 10 million people is suffering very slightly less, because they suffer the same agony but for 1 day less. So the average is less suffering, so therefore that one should be preferred. But of course there's 10 million of them, so no, we would say, no, clearly that's worse, because there's 10 million people suffering instead of just 10. But that's the effect. If all you care about is the quality, you ignore the quantity. So that's obviously a non-starter. Then we look at the limited quantity view. We look at options 6 and 5 on page 403, his chart. So for example, 6, which he calls the limited quantity view, says, the value of quantity has an upper limit, and in the world today this limit has been reached. 5 is a more sophisticated, but he says essentially similar view. The value of quantity can never be above certain upper limits. As the actual level of quantity increases, the value of extra quantity declines. So the more people we have, the value of each extra person declines. Think of this as column Z in the repugnant conclusion is getting wider. The value of the area under each person declines. And asymptotically approaches 0. When the level of quality is higher, there is a higher upper limit to the value of quantity. So this tries to sort of connect the value of quantity to the value of quality, to the amount of quality, to the height of the column in the charts that we saw in the repugnant conclusion. So that's one way of trying to value both quality and quantity. So at this point, we've got these 3 requirements. There are 3 constraints on theory X that we have achieved so far. First is quality always has value. And the reason for this is so that we avoid the repugnant conclusion, because the repugnant conclusion just focused on quantity, and the area under that very low bar Z was still higher than the area of A, because it was ignoring the height. It said you don't have to, that doesn't have to affect things. We're just looking at the area. So this, we've learned because of the repugnant conclusion that quality must always have value. But there is upper limit on value of quantity of happiness, or the good stuff, on value of quantity. Because if there isn't an upper limit, again, we get the repugnant conclusion. A vast number of, of lives that are barely worth living trumps a much smaller number of very good lives. So there's an upper limit to the value of quantity, but we don't want it to be a case that there is an upper of the good stuff, usually happiness, whatever we're valuing, whatever our theory of well-being is. That could be, if we have a desire satisfaction model, that could be satisfied desires. If we have a simple hedonic one, that should be pleasure or something like that. Whatever we're valuing, there is an upper limit on the value of that. But there is no upper limit on disvalue of bad stuff, suffering. Why do we need this? To explain the asymmetry. Because it is a bad thing that suffering is always bad. If we increase the amount of suffering, we don't want it to be the case that we're discounting suffering at any point. We're discounting, from a moral point of view, the value, the increased amount of quantity, because we want to avoid the repugnant conclusion. But we don't want to make the mistake of discounting suffering, because suffering is, in some sense, the existence of suffering is worse than the non-existence of pleasure. So these 2 points represent the asymmetry between the importance of pleasure and the importance of suffering. Now, unfortunately, though, these lead to the ridiculous conclusion. So once we recognize the asymmetry, that leads to the ridiculous conclusion. What is the ridiculous conclusion? Well, essentially it's this. Compare, first option, 10 billion people with a high standard of living. Second option, a much higher number of people with a much higher standard of living. So it's wider and taller if you look at the graph. So you've got your A graph, and then you imagine a column next to it that is even higher and also wider. So that sounds like it should be better, because you're respecting quality and quantity. The catch is their lives contain some intense suffering. Now, the suffering is outweighed, but it's because the suffering exists, we've got to count it. And because there's so many of them, even though there's in their lives a fairly small, in each life there is a fairly small amount of suffering, that they will say is worth it for their high standard of living, no pain, no gain. But because there is no upper limit on the disvalue of the suffering, that amount of suffering trumps the absence of suffering in the smaller column. So you got the small column, and then you got the big column, but this contains some suffering. But because of the suffering and because of this, we say, the suffering, because there's much more suffering in this column, it's worse, and we can't place an upper limit on it, so it swamps the upper limit on the value of the quantity of good. So there's a huge amount of good, but when you add more and more good, there comes a point when we reach an upper limit and it doesn't count. But there's no upper limit on the suffering that we keep adding. So the bigger it gets, the more that the bad stuff outweighs the good stuff. And so our constraints here on theory X that we've reached so far mean that we reach the ridiculous conclusion that the first column, where there's 10 billion people and a lower standard of living, is better, just because it doesn't have this suffering in it. Now, in an attempt to avoid the ridiculous conclusion, Parfit suggests this. Maybe we can draw a distinction between types of suffering. Maybe some types of suffering are worse than others. So, for example, uncompensated suffering is unqualifiedly bad. What's uncompensated suffering? That's like the suffering of a child with Hallappo-Siemens syndrome. It's suffering in a life that's not worth living. It's just suffering. Whereas people who suffer but would say that their life is worth living, then they would say, I would choose this life even though it contains suffering. Like most disabled people say that, you know, I think my life is valuable. I think I have a good life. Clearly, I would prefer not to be disabled, but and that causes some suffering. But in general, my life is good. That would be compensated suffering. So he says, so we draw this distinction, compensated versus uncompensated. Compensated is suffering that occurs within a life that is worth living. Uncompensated is in a life that is not worth living. There is no upper limit on the dis value of uncompensated suffering. So that's our suggestion, uncompensated. Our suggestion for dealing with that. But also, more compensated suffering, you can have more compensated suffering that is not bad, which is when we add an extra person with a life worth living but with suffering in it. So that would be, there is an upper limit on the dis value of compensated suffering that occurs because we've got a new person added. Now, he says, there is no upper limit on the dis value of also within an already existing life. So there's no already existing life. So there is compensated suffering that there is no upper limit on, and that's if we keep adding suffering to, so somebody says my life is good and worth living, and we say, what if we ratchet up your suffering a bit? Still worth living. Okay, I'm going to give you a bit more suffering. Still worth living. Adding that suffering, it's still compensated because it is contained within a life that is worth living, but we're adding it to that life. Whereas there is an upper limit to the dis value of compensated suffering, which happens because we add a new life that is worth living with some suffering in it. Whew. I hope you get that. Okay, so if we make that distinction, then we appear to avoid the ridiculous conclusion. However, we then hit the absurd confusion. So here's the compensated versus uncompensated suffering. We hit the absurd conclusion. Okay, the absurd conclusion is, again, that our theory favors the wrong result. So here are the two options. Option A is, say, we have 500 billion people living at a very high quality of life, but in each 10 billion there would be one unfortunate person. So this is somebody who, because it's a person whose life is not worth living, one unfortunate person with a disease that makes him suffer and have a life that is not worth living, then that person has uncompensated suffering, so again there is no upper limit to them. Now, there is exactly the same number of people, except they're spread out over 50 centuries with only 10 billion per century. So here the absurd conclusion is comparing exactly the same number of people with exactly the same, with 1 in every 10 billion has a life that's not worth living. 500 billion of them compared with 500 billion people with high standard of living, and 1 every 10 billion has a life that's not worth living. So exactly the same numbers of people, except in the first case they happen all at once and spread out over planets. He gives this kind of science fiction idea that we've colonized the solar system. But then the second option is spread out over 50 centuries, say, so only 10 billion exist in each century. Now, he says, as a result of this, by the calculations of the theory so far, the first one is bad, and in fact is so bad that it's worse than no people existing at all, whereas the second is very good. And he says, as he says, if the second outcome would be very good, and the first outcome differs only with respect to when people live, how can this difference in timing make the first outcome very bad? So what is the problem with the theory so far is that it's making distinctions where it shouldn't make distinctions. It should value these two options the same, but it's saying that one of them is very bad, where all of the 50 billion exist at the same time, albeit, spread out over a large area, whereas the other one says the 50 billion are spread out over 50 centuries. It's making evaluations that are arbitrary, and so clearly there's a problem with that theory. All right, in an attempt to avoid the absurd conclusion, he suggests a couple of other theories. So there's the appeal to the valueless level. Quantity has no value in lives whose quality is below a certain level. If these lives are worth living, they have personal value, but the fact that such lives are lived does not make the outcome morally better. So we already have the idea that there's a level at which a life is not worth living. That's where you only have suffering below this. But he wants to say, okay, maybe there's a level above that, which is the valueless level. Now, anything between here is a life that's worth living for the person who lives it. They would say, my life is worth living. But that value should only be counted personally. It's only valuable to them. It's not something that we should count in our moral calculations, that we should use as affecting our decisions. Because that value, that is not of moral value. It's a life, a bit, he compares it like to a contented oyster. That clearly it's good for the oyster that it is contented, but we shouldn't necessarily, we shouldn't say a vast quantity of oysters is more valuable than a few humans, just because, they have, although they have low value of life, a vast quantity of them adds up to more than ours. And he says to rule that out, we will count it as zero. So even though in theory it should count for something, we're going to say up to this level it counts for nothing, except to the person who has it, but not in our moral calculations. Quantity has no value in lives whose quality is below a certain level. If these lives are worth living, because they're above this baseline, they have personal value, but the fact that such lives are lived does not make the outcome morally better. This avoids the absurd conclusion because the good lives are above the valueless limit, and thus their value counts and they outweigh the suffering. So whereas the bad lives are below it, presumably. Alternatively, we have the lexical view, and the lexical view, so both of these are attempts to balance the quantity with quality and also avoid the bad implications of the asymmetry. The lexical view says there is no limit to the positive value of quantity. It is always better if an extra life is lived that is worth living, but it makes a distinction between two kinds of lives, mediocre and blissful. And mediocre are below a certain level and blissful are above a certain level. And no amount of mediocre lives, 100 million mediocre lives, are not worth one blissful life. no amount of mediocre lives could have as much value as one blissful life. Now again, this sounds very elitist. It's a bit like saying, well, the life of the poor, a life of 1 million poor people is not worth the life of one royalty. But what he's saying is that the mediocre lives are lives that contain, that are a bit like oysters. So I don't know what kind of humans he's thinking of, but their pleasure is of so little value that we don't want to add it up. We can't have it be the case that 1 billion of these lower lives will swamp one higher life, because that's what the problem was with the repugnant conclusion. Okay, does that solve the problem? Well, he says no, not really, because the valueless level theory gives a version of the absurd conclusion. A future with 1 in 10 billion who doesn't have with 10 billion people with a high standard of living and one person who doesn't have a life worth living. Well, no. A future with one person who doesn't have a life worth living and 10 billion who have lives that are worth living but are below the valueless level would be worse than 0 people. Why? Because we would count the suffering of the one person, and we wouldn't count the happiness of the 10 billion because it's below the valueless level. So now we count the negative, but we don't count the positive, so we ended up with negative, so it's worse than nothing. That's a version of the absurd conclusion. But, if we're talking about contented oysters, I don't know that he says that's less absurd. Maybe we can accept that. But we also have a version of the repugnant conclusion. In this case, remember, the repugnant conclusion was that Z is better than A, even though the quality is very low in Z, just so long as the quality of the lives are just barely above the valueless level, then we will count the lives in Z, and they will still trump the lives in A. So as he says, if we raise the valueless level, this will make our version of the repugnant conclusion less repugnant, because if the more we raise the height of Z, then it seems like maybe we should favor Z over A. So it becomes less repugnant the taller that Z becomes. And if we raise the valueless level, then we will be raising the height of column Z. But if we raise the valueless level, it will make our version of the absurd conclusion more absurd, because then we will be discounting, the lives that we will be discounting are ones that are just below the upper limit of the valueless level, and the higher they get, the more it seems like we shouldn't discount them. So we are left with an attempt to fix to come up with a theory X that does seem to avoid the worst version of the repugnant conclusion, but still a version of it, and the worst version of the absurd conclusion, but still a version of it. Maybe we fixed the non-identity problem at least. As he keeps saying, I have made progress, but of a negative kind. The progress is we solve one problem, but it's negative because we face another one. Each time we solve one problem, a new problem comes up. And it turns out that there's a new problem that he's going to introduce in the next chapter, the mere addition paradox. So it's going to be, we thought maybe we can live with this version of the absurd and the repugnant conclusion, but wait a minute, bam, here comes the mere addition paradox to say that that's unacceptable. So, spoiler alert, we never reach a final version of theory X, but Parfit says maybe somebody else will finish the job for me, and people are working on it.